I'm Roy Wetherbee. I've been collecting New England OA since Rob Cutts, who's also on the call, wrote his book back in 1987. So when my wife's mad, I can always blame it on Rob. But anyway, my background, I've been collecting since 1977 when I attended my first Jamboree. I started collecting Jamboree at first, but I focused on New England OA since Rob Cutts wrote his first OA book back in 1987. I was also the Blue Book regional editor for New England for the 6 printed volumes. I was ASTA area VP and then later Northeast Region VP and ISCA Northeast Region VP until they eliminated the position in 2010. I'm a past lodge advisor at Packagug Lodge 525 here in central Massachusetts, and I'll be covering my own lodge there in a later presentation. So this presentation was inspired by the North Carolina Showstoppers presentation that was presented last fall. It's outside of my area, so I don't know a lot of about lodges in North Carolina, but I found it really educational. I learned a lot from that presentation, and I thought it would be worthwhile doing it for my area. The thing is, a lot of the showstoppers from New England are pretty well known. People have seen them, they've seen pictures, may or may not have had them, because some of them are pretty tough. So I thought as a twist, I'd talk about the sleepers, the lesser known issues, or perhaps the unknown issues that are from these lodges. So I've got 73 lodges to cover up here in New England. And so obviously not something we're going to cover in one night. So I've broken it up. Yeah. I've broken it up into 5 parts, and I'm going to start out with really the smallest section, but perhaps the least well-known part of New England, the northern states, which include Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. And that's currently a total of 4 active lodges. And then there were 4 merged lodges involved as well. And then I think in 2 weeks, I'm scheduled for part 2, which will be Rhode Island and Southeast Massachusetts. They kind of go together now because the Narragansett Council has been slowly absorbing Massachusetts councils and moving east. That presentation will also cover Cape Cod, and I know there are several Cape Cod guys on the call. And then Massachusetts, we have broken that up into the east and northeast. And oddly enough, the entire eastern and northeastern section of the state, which used to be 16 lodges, is now 1. And then I'll cover the Central Mass part, which is now 2 active lodges with 14 merged lodges. And then finally, Connecticut. And with 20 lodges, I may or may not have to break that up, but we'll see how that goes. But that's basically the plan. And these are roughly scheduled, I think, 2 weeks apart. So we'll start out, I'm sorry, where are we? Northern New England. So this part's Northern New England, and Maine has 2 very old lodges, and so far both are untouched by mergers. So Pamola Lodge 211, chartered in 1941. It incidentally disbanded in 1951 and then rechartered in the mid-50s. And then Madokawanda Lodge 271 in the southeastern part of Maine, chartered in 1944. And then we'll move west towards New Hampshire. New Hampshire again has 1 very old lodge. It's more or less untouched by mergers. It covers the entire state now. Prior to the last round of mergers, there were a couple of towns in the southeast corner that were part of a Massachusetts council, but Passaconaway Lodge now covers the entire state of New Hampshire. And then finally, Vermont, which again is a 1 lodge state, Ojibwe 351, which chartered in 1973. And that was formed by the merger of 351 Weesey Hal'a and 398 Nyank, which was itself formed by the merger of Memphis Magog and Nicaweegee lodges. And so we'll go through those lodges. I'm going to approach them more or less in like chronological order. So we'll start with the oldest lodge, 211 Maine. And so the Showstoppers, what's funny about Lodge 211 is a lot of their stuff is just really, really common. And it was for many, many years. Their F1, which went through at least 3 loom runs, possibly more, is pretty common, pretty well known, pretty easy to get. You can still pick up that, it's got to be 50 years old now, and you can still pick them up for under $10. But in terms of Showstoppers, and this probably dates to that early period of the lodge from 41 to 51, is a Caldwell pin. There is a Pamola Lodge Caldwell pin. It doesn't have a Vigil emblem on it, so I'm assuming it's a Brotherhood pin. It's a Showstopper and a sleeper at the same time, because there's only currently one known, and that's in Built Up because it's a fantastic collection. So, and then there are a couple of really old, really elusive leathers, but they have kind of dubious provenance. So the 211 dog bone leather, there are 2, maybe 3 slightly different handmade varieties that were pictured on OA images. In my opinion, these were made by a lodge member, but I wouldn't say they were issued to the lodge. I think these were more likely just made by somebody in summer camp handicraft lodge doing, working on, leatherworking mirror badge or something like that. And then the L2, which I have a picture of here, that was not ever pictured on OA images because it's unique. This one is in the lodge collection, and because they bring that to section conclaves and display it, I've been able to snap some pictures. But again, this is made by someone in the lodge, no doubt, but it is, it's unique. There are no other ones known. So I wouldn't consider it an issue per se. That doesn't mean if I ran across one at a yard sale, I'd pass on it either, though. So, and then there's actually an L3 that's not even listed, which is a Neckerchief slide version of this design, the L2 design. So, what's interesting about Pamola Lodge 211 is, they are the northeasternmost lodge in the country. It's from a very sparsely populated part of the state and part of New England. So it's a very small lodge. And I have only one active collector trader contact in that entire lodge. So there's not a lot of trading. You could argue that everything they issue is a sleeper because it just doesn't get out. But the ones I chose to feature here, this first one is their X1, and it dates to the mid 1990s. So it's probably 25 years old at this point. And Takashin is, I believe, Delaware for leader. It was their lodge leadership development. It was an award for trained lodge leaders. This was gifted to me by their staff advisor, who was transferred to my council just a few years after this was issued. He knew I was looking for it. I knew about it, but I didn't really have any contacts or sources for it. He just gave it to me one day. I have never seen another one available for trade or sale since. So I was very happy to have it. This next one, the Pamola Lodge 08 Trek, obviously Maine High Adventure Base. It's no longer a national base, but it's still running. Madokawanda is still a summer program. It's actually administered by Pine Tree Council. And starting, I want to say around 1993, their lodge started to do a summer trek. And they've been doing it off and on ever since. So again, for the last 25 years or so, they've been going to Madokawanda and doing a week or 2 week long canoeing trek each summer. This was the very first one they ever did. They were one per person. And this is another one where I picked one up from a person who had gone, and I have never seen another one. So now the dog bone below it, inspired by that leather patch, was again another lodge award. I don't have any details on what the requirements were. I just know that it was very hard to earn, and I've only seen 2 of them. And this dates back at least 10 or 15 years. And then finally, activities. So activities and other purposes. So they borrowed the moose head design from the Maine High Adventure, base patch that they used to have on felt for your red jacket. And they've started in about 2005, started doing first a fellowship. And then, so this was like a 2005, 2007, 2009 fellowship. And then they started using it for other awards. So this here is actually maybe 2010. You may not be able to read it here in the presentation, but participant is ghosted into the antler there. And there are at least another dozen varieties of moose heads with different things ghosted into the antlers. So just finding one of these is incredibly difficult. They're in my section, and I still don't see them. And so they have 2 or 3 different versions of a langamat. So it'll have a langamat ghosted into the antlers. There's a vigil guide. There's one for ordeals. Like I said, I don't even have pictures of all of them, but there are at least another dozen varieties of these moose head activity patches or urn patches in the case of langamats. Terribly difficult, even if you know about them. And I'm honestly betting that most people outside of the area have never seen them. I've never seen any of these turn up on eBay, and I, of course, watch for my area stuff pretty closely. So these are all definitely sleepers. Again, this lodge is so small and so remote that almost everything they issue is, in a sense, a sleeper. So we'll go to the next page here. And this lodge loves to issue fundraiser patches with ghosted serial numbers in them. This is a tiny fraction of what they have, but anytime you get a newer, say, solid embroidered 211 patch or 2-piece set, look for a ghosted number somewhere on the patch, because they put those on everything. So here they were going to the National Leadership Seminar, and so they had a patch unnumbered for their people going, so they had something to trade. And then they had these serial numbered versions that were sold as a fundraiser prior to the event to help fund that contingent. Here they were going to the NCLS, same deal. You can see a ghosted 6 here. There's a ghosted 6 here. This over here was part of their 70th anniversary set. They did a set of 3 for Ordeal Brotherhood Vigil, numbered and unnumbered. So there's this ghosted number under the 211 there. And then this was just a regular issue flap. They issued a new design and decided to sell some numbered ones as fundraisers. They do it a lot. They've been doing it with pretty much every NOAC since the early 90s, every jamboree. Some of their fundraisers are incredibly difficult. I don't have them pictured here, but they'll have some of these numbered sets with like a blue mylar border seems to be their favorite color. And every fundraiser, there'll be a fundraiser, but then there'll be a benefactor flap. And that can be anywhere, production anywhere from 10 to 30 made. And again, they've been doing that since the early 90s as well. So a lot of times if you see, I think this is a regular blue border, but if you turn up a 211 flap and it happens to have a blue mylar border, it very well could be one of their super rare fundraiser flaps. They have a short list of people in council that tend to pony up when donations are needed, and they typically sell for over $100. But again, such a small lodge, such a small council, and they typically sell those out. So something else to look for. But anytime you get a 211 patch, look for a ghosted number somewhere on it, and that will be one of their limited edition fundraisers. So moving a bit south, we have Madokawanda Lodge 271. It's notable, one, for its first flap. I think it's a rating 6 or 7. It's one of the half moon flaps, cut edge, pretty difficult to find in mint condition. So any first flap collector is going to recognize that. And then of course, their X1 felt was a Wabaningo issue. So these, one of these was pictured in the WAB book. So anybody attempting the Herculean task of completing a WAB collection will be looking for these. There were a couple of different versions issued over the years. Both of mine came from lodge members, so have pretty solid provenance with those. So those are the showstoppers. WAB collectors will recognize it. First flap collectors will recognize it. What people don't know is that the F2 of this lodge is easily 5 times harder to find than the first flap. So it's a normal flap design. It's got a cut edge, incredibly defined in any condition, and especially difficult to find in mint condition. So I consider that the earliest sleeper from that lodge. What I have over here is a shellacked pine cone neckerchief slide with a red arrow on it. This came with one of my X1 felts from a person in the lodge that had attended the 1950 National Jamboree. So this is, I'm sure, their lodge's first neckerchief slide. Whether or not it was available to anyone in the lodge or just say people that went to the 50 NOAC or National Jamboree, I'm not really sure. But it's one of those things that, if you don't know, you don't know. Another one here is their 50th anniversary patch. A lot of lodges, when they have an anniversary, they'll issue anniversary patches, and they're not necessarily difficult. But this one is their 50th anniversary award, and it had to be earned, and you could only earn one. And it took me 20 years of chasing to finally get one for my collection here. I know I had shared this image with Bruce Shelley, who writes the OA column for the ISCA Journal. And he also collects anniversaries, 50th anniversaries in particular. And, he was thankful because he had never seen it. And then the final sleeper I have here is that in 2000, this lodge was awarded the National Service Award. And they had 2 versions. This purple version, which is, I'm sorry, it's kind of hard to read, but I only have a bad photo of it, was like 1 per person. Incredibly hard to find. And then they have a black oval with yellow lettering and borders, which was their trader, or the one that was unlimited at any rate. And you see that around. That's not too difficult. But anybody on the call sees the purple one, I'm looking for it. I'm your Huckleberry. So pretty difficult. And again, I could hop in the car and be in this council in an hour, maybe an hour and a half, not that far away. So more sleepers. What's interesting here, I know there are a few people looking for it. This felt was something that they produced at the 92 NOAC in their Founders Day booth. They were silk screening them and cutting them out on demand if you went to their Founders Day booth. And of course, after that, they didn't make any more. So this is definitely something that you had to be in the right place at the right time. I went to NOAC in 92 and I was in the right place at the right time. Here is a chapter patch from Madokawanda. And, in a lot of lodges, I mean, here you've got a small lodge and then you divide it into even smaller chapters. And a lot of the sleepers in this presentation you'll see are chapter patches, just because the smaller membership means smaller circulation. And so they tend not to get out. This is one of, I believe, 2 York chapter patches that Rob had listed in his original publication. So this goes back to the early 80s, early 90s. And then there's another one that I don't have. And those are the ones we know about. There may be more. Another sleeper from this lodge is their lodge leader development. They ran this for a number of years and had this patch. So if you took the LLD with the lodge, so again, this was limited to, lodge and chapter officers and, maybe advisors. You would earn this patch starting in 2002. And then you get these repeater pins. So they have a W in a 2003, W 2004, a W in 2005. Those are the only ones I'm aware of. But again, because of its limited circulation and the fact that it had to be earned by a smaller subset of the lodge, very, very hard to come by. And then not surprisingly, Alangamat programs. In many lodges, Alangamat issues are earned. And in many cases, you earn it once. So that's just what the Madokawanda Lodge Alangamat patch looks like. I picked it up just a couple years ago, so I'm thinking this may still be current. But again, it's just not something you see wander outside of the lodge. And then finally, this other one was a committee. Their publications committee produced this patch in 2006, celebrating their Turtle Soup, which is their lodge newsletter. And again, this is one that I chased for more than a decade before I finally found one. Committee, again, is another small subset of an already small lodge. So, something you just don't see. So moving west to New Hampshire, and again, as you mentioned, 220 was an early lodge, chartered in 1944, and has never merged, although it did acquire a couple of extra towns a few years ago. In terms of Showstoppers, any first flap collector will recognize their cut edge. It's misspelled with a single S, which is the tell for the first flap. And then they have an R1 felt, which is also very rare. And then for, I think, a very long number of years, they had this felt on felt on felt. It's a felt from Pennsylvania. It's was used. There's many handmade varieties of this felt. I wouldn't say it's the most common felt issue in New England, but it's on the common side as far as felts go. That's not, I'm not putting it down by any means. There are some with 3 dots, there's some with 2 dots, there's some with a chevron on the arrowhead, there's a solid arrowhead, there's an open arrowhead. I have one specimen of this where you can see the blue because they would trace the design out on the felt with old carbon paper. and it would leave a trace, and you can see the blue, and then they would just stitch over it by hand. So, you know, strictly speaking, everyone is different. Handmade varieties exist. But sleepers, you know, these guys are tough. Well, all right, so I'll talk about this sleeper first. And this is one that I know Rob knows about. This is basically a chapter patch, but it was, as the story goes, made by the advisor for just 6 people who attended the 1971 Area 1F conclave. And so this picture here with the original die and the patch and the note are in the Lee Museum at Camp Carpenter up in Manchester, New Hampshire. Camp Carpenter's got 1 or 2 of these, and I've got 2 of these, and I know somebody else that has 2 of these. So I question the 5 made number personally. But it's not common. And again, it's a chapter patch. Chapter patches tend to be obscure. But surprisingly, one of the very toughest patches in all of New Hampshire was their 1979 NOAC patch, which was this rectangle on the left. I had the F1 and the R1 and the X1 and pretty much most of the state before I got one of these. It is the true definition of a sleeper. It was the first NOAC that they had, you know, ever made a patch for. They didn't make another patch for NOAC for years and years. This guy is really tough, really hard to find. That said, most people wouldn't recognize it. And so, you know, good chance that you'd pick it up for a reasonable price. And then again, getting back to these earned awards, this is their current Alangamat patch. And then it has a trained pin, and then it has repeater pins that you can only earn like once a year for being an Alangamat. You get 1 patch and you earn the pins 1 at a time. And this is a need for me. This is something I've been looking for probably half a dozen years now. So pretty difficult. If you see it, you've got a buyer. And so we'll move on to Vermont. And the oldest Vermont lodge is Weese Halicon 351. First flap collectors will recognize their cut edge first flap with the arrow going the wrong way as being really an exceptionally difficult first flap. I forget whether it was a rating. It's not a 10, it's probably a 9. And then the R1, which is on purple felt, this is another WOB issue. So again, those Wabaningo collectors will be looking for this particular variety. Both of these typically sell for 4 figures. Pretty desirable, you know, definitely coveted by the people in the state up there in Vermont, as well as wild collectors, first flap collectors. But sleepers and, you know, for Weese, it merged, you know, back in 72. So at this point, there's not that much unknown from the lodge. I'm sure everything that they issued is known. But their Vigil Necrochef here on the right is just killer. And I would call that both a showstopper as well as a sleeper because it is so very rare, and a showstopper because it is so impressive when you see it in real life. For the longest time, the only one I had ever seen was again on display in the Lee Museum at Camp Carpenter in New Hampshire. And I used to just, you know, drool every time I went there and saw it on display. It was fantastic. On the sleeper side, unexpectedly, if you were looking for some of their powwow or fellowship issues, the 1971 powwow is exceptionally difficult. This is actually more difficult than any of their flaps, except possibly the F1. You know, just something to look for. And doesn't look that impressive. It's not pretty. But again, it's just super scarce. And then the Vigil Necrochef just speaks for itself. What's interesting is towards the end of the presentation, I'll show you something very similar to this that came out of the same area. So the next lodge in Vermont was Memphis Magog, 398. Name collectors will recognize this as one of the better and tougher names. And the first flap is there were only two flaps, an F1 and an S1. Finding the F1 is what the first flap collectors are all looking for. Pretty much F1, S1, and a couple of varieties of round are all that have ever been cataloged from this lodge. They had like an R1, whether you call it an A and a B or a 1 and a 2. These are all exceptionally difficult. The rounds are much tougher than the flaps. Memphis Magog is the name of a lake in what they call the Northeast Kingdom in Vermont, which is a super sparsely populated corner of the state. And again, that's all they had. If I had to say something's a sleeper, it's finding the rounds, mint or near mint on neckerchiefs. They had two different shades of neckerchief and the two different rounds from two different periods. That's it. I would love to see something new discovered from that corner of the state. But I'd say at this point, they merged in 64. So, at this point, it's likely that anything they had has been discovered. So I say that. And then there's Nicoji Lodge 493, which is kind of the eastern part of the state, eastern central part of the state. The lodge was named, so there was the Nicaweegee Pre-OA Society that existed at a number of camps and councils in New England at the time. And so their camp is one that, obviously had a Nicaweegee program. Their first flap is a cut edge, white background, couple of different super minor varieties where the lock stitching is a little bit different. They're effectively the same patch though. If I had to pick a showstopper, this is the patch that most collectors would be looking for just because it's a, first flap. But for sleepers, the 493 Neckerchief, which is a need for me, only surfaced about, so the lodge merged in 1964 and this neckerchief only surfaced maybe 10 years ago. So it hasn't been listed. It was never listed in Blue Book because it wasn't known there. I think at this point I've seen or know of 3. I'm hoping there are more out there because I need one. But that was definitely a sleeper that escaped notice for 35 years. Crazy. And then there was a 493 Neil slide. So this is a custom made Neil slide. It has 493 the bear was a standard issue, but the 493 in relief was custom to this lodge. I collect every little knickknack that New England lodges issue. And as far as Neil slides go, there's really only one other that I'd say is tougher than this one. So again, the neckerchief and neckerchief slide together are the sleepers from Nicoji Lodge 493. And then Yonk was formed by that merger. So this lodge formed in 64, 65. Again, I'd say the showstopper that people might be looking for is their first flap. Not a killer by any means. It can be had for, $75 pretty much anytime anyone's looking for one. And there was an S1 and an S2 that came out later. In terms of sleepers, I'd say the obscure issues from this lodge would be the pie or the neckerchief. So in this case, I have one that's off the neckerchief and I have one that's on the neckerchief. finding these at all is pretty difficult. And there are varieties. So there's a variety with the thin stars, and then there's a variety here with thick stars. And there are other differences, some white detailing in the panther. Here it's not there. But just looking quickly at the small stars and the large stars are the way to spot the difference. And fairly certain that the version with the large stars, I always see on neckerchiefs. I've never seen one off the neckerchief. And yet the reverse is true of the version with the small stars. I see these off the neckerchief all the time, and I've only seen a couple that were on the neckerchief. So I suspect the reason there are so many of these left over off the neckerchief is this was the latter issue, and they had some stock when the lodge finally merged. And then finally, they merged into the current Ojibwe Lodge 351. So, you know, it's a pretty new lodge. It chartered in 1973, hasn't had a lot of time to put out a ton of what you'd consider showstoppers compared to some of the issues that we looked at earlier in the presentation. But their first flap is pretty tough to come by. Pretty hard to find mint because it was their first flap. A lot of them got sewn on uniforms. And then I have this one here. I was going to squeeze it onto my sleeper slide and I didn't have room. Their 20th anniversary flap is just killer. They made 200, which isn't a necessarily small run. But it turns out, and people could buy as many as they wanted, but it turns out pretty much anyone who bought them bought one. It took me forever to find one, to find somebody that had one. I couldn't find anyone that had a dupe. And I did finally pick one up. Wow, I want to say it was at the Dallas Traderie, but from somebody from upstate New York, of all places. And it was a substantial trade to get it, but their 20th anniversary is both a sleeper and a showstopper. So then we can start looking at some sleepers, and these are the sleepers that everyone in Vermont is looking for. So in this case, it's a fellowship patch. I know now this lodge does fellowships and they never make more than 50. This one, you can see kind of writing underneath the lettering, and then it was stitched over. So I suspect there were far fewer than 50 made of this Norwich University fellowship. And then, as I mentioned when I was speaking about the WC Hal'a Vigil, this Crown Point chapter patch is something I picked up on eBay in a lot that came out of that part of Vermont where WC had been. And I suspect that this particular chapter felt that they wanted a Vigil patch or neckerchief, just as their recently merged lodge had. So again, you don't really see chapters from this lodge now. But both of these are, as far as I know, one knowns. And, you know, I could put you in touch with a dozen guys in Vermont that would kill for either one of these. So those are real sleepers from a state that already has some pretty tough stuff in it. So that's New England, northern New England, from the sleepers and showstoppers angle. I didn't put a closing slide on here, but I'd be happy to answer any questions people might have at this point.
I think the presentation is a piece of art, but how many years you think you got invested just in this section of sleepers?
I started collecting at the 77 Jamboree. I started collecting Jamboree. Seemed to make sense. I used to go to traderies. At that point, I was just out of college. I'd go to traderies and I'd sit and not, all the action was in OA, plain and simple. I'd go to traderies and I'd do nothing and I'd feel left out, and everybody else is doing OA, and I didn't really want to start a name number collection at 22, but and then a few years later, Rob Cutts published the first New England memorabilia guide, and I bought one of those copies at one of the New Hampshire traderies, and I looked at that and I said, yeah, that seems doable, not knowing what a Madocam or
just a few states with just a few lodges.
exactly. Don't try to collect the whole country, just do a little piece.
Yeah.
That mountain does not look tall at all.
It's 120 miles away, though.